Why are so many Jewish people seen as being wealthy? It is a question that feels incredibly heavy, loaded with centuries upon centuries of stereotypes, misinformation, and genuine pain. It's a question that many people feel uncomfortable asking, and frankly, even more people feel uncomfortable answering. For some, asking this question conjures up dark, shadowy images of global conspiracies and secret cabals, dangerous ideas that have been wielded as justification for hatred, persecution, and horrific violence for generations. For others, however, the question comes from a place of genuine, if perhaps naive, curiosity. It's a question that arises from simply looking at the world and noticing what appears to be a pattern of disproportionate success in demanding and influential fields like finance, law, medicine, technology, and the arts. In this video, we are going to confront that question directly, with the seriousness and depth it deserves. Our goal is not to lend any credence to harmful and baseless stereotypes, but rather to uncover the profound historical, cultural, and sociological roots that have shaped the extraordinarily complex economic story of the Jewish people. We're going to embark on a journey that spans 2,000 years of history to understand how a group that was relentlessly persecuted, displaced, and marginalized managed not only to survive, but in many instances, to thrive against all odds. This is not a story about any inherent superiority or a secret plot for world domination. That is the stuff of hateful fantasy. Instead, this is a story of how a truly unique set of historical circumstances, combined with a specific set of cultural values forged in the fires of adversity, created a special and often fraught relationship with commerce, education, and community. We will meticulously separate the persistent, poisonous myths from the complicated and often surprising truths of a history defined by unparalleled resilience, a deep-seated reverence for learning, and the incredible power of a tight-knit, supportive community. To truly understand the present, we must go back to the beginning. Way back. Chapter 1. Unpacking the loaded question, myth versus reality. Before we dive into the depths of history, let's be absolutely and unequivocally clear. The notion that all Jews are rich is a dangerous, pernicious, and provably false stereotype. It is a gross caricature that flattens a diverse global community of nearly 16 million individuals into a single, monolithic, and misleading image. This stereotype has its origins in some of the most toxic and influential anti-Semitic propaganda ever created, most notoriously, the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. This was a fraudulent, fabricated text, first published in Russia in the early 1900s, that purported to be the minutes of a secret meeting of Jewish leaders plotting to achieve global domination through financial control. Despite being thoroughly debunked as a forgery, this myth has been recycled and repurposed for over a century, always carrying the same deadly poison of envy, fear, and suspicion. So, if we push aside the propaganda, what does the actual data tell us about the economic reality of the Jewish community today? The truth is far more nuanced and complex. According to a landmark 2020 Pew Research Center study focused on Jewish Americans, while the community as a whole does trend towards higher levels of educational attainment and household income compared to the general population, this is far from a universal or uniform truth. For instance, while approximately half of Jewish adults in the United States report a household income exceeding $100,000, a simple flip of that statistic reveals a crucial fact: the other half do not. In fact, the data shows significant economic diversity. 10% of Jewish people in the U.S. live in households with an annual income below $30,000. Digging deeper, a 2025 analysis revealed that 23% of Jews in the United States are considered to be financially vulnerable, with nearly a third of the community reporting that they struggle to pay their monthly bills. These are not the numbers of a uniformly wealthy people. Poverty is a real and persistent issue within the Jewish community, just as it is within any other group. The stereotype completely and cruelly ignores the lived experiences of working-class Jews, of recent immigrant families struggling to find their footing, and of elderly individuals, including Holocaust survivors, living on fixed and often insufficient incomes. The perception of universal wealth is often fueled by a cognitive bias, a trick our minds play on us based on what is most visible. The colossal success of a handful of extremely high-profile individuals in finance, media, and technology can create a distorted and unrepresentative picture of the entire group. We see prominent names like Mark Zuckerberg of Facebook, Larry Ellison of Oracle, or we think of the historical financial influence of families like the Rothschilds, and the stereotype seems to confirm itself in our minds. But these individuals are the exceptions. They are the statistical outliers, not the norm. Their incredible success, as we will explore, can be traced back to the very same historical and cultural forces that helped lift the community as a whole, just amplified to a much larger and more visible scale. They are the glittering tip of the iceberg, but the stereotype wrongly and dangerously assumes the entire iceberg, all the way down to its vast, unseen depths, is made of the same shiny, visible ice. The origins of this stereotype are not recent. They are firmly planted in the soil of medieval Europe. During this era, religious laws throughout Christendom, known as canon law, strictly forbade Christians from lending money at interest. This practice, called usury, was considered a sin. This prohibition, however, did not eliminate the need for credit. It simply created an economic vacuum. Kings needed to fund wars, merchants needed to finance trade, and common people needed loans to survive. Jewish communities, who were often legally barred from the primary sources of wealth, owning land or joining the powerful artisan guilds, were systematically pushed into this economic niche. They became the moneylenders, a profession that was simultaneously vital to the functioning of the economy and socially despised. They were necessary, yet they were ostracized, demonized, and feared for the very role society had forced upon them. This created a toxic and precarious dynamic. Rulers and nobles would borrow immense sums from Jewish lenders. When it came time to repay those debts, it was often politically and financially easier to incite public anger, organize a violent riot or pogrom, and ultimately expel the entire Jewish community from the kingdom, conveniently erasing all outstanding debts in the process. This historical role cemented the association between Jews and money in the European consciousness for a millennium. William Shakespeare's character Shylock from The Merchant of Venice is perhaps the most enduring and famous example of this archetype, the greedy, cold-hearted, and vengeful Jewish moneylender. While literary scholars continue to debate whether the play itself is anti-Semitic or a sophisticated commentary on the pervasive anti-Semitism of the time, the character of Shylock has echoed through the centuries, reinforcing the ugly caricature of Jews as being obsessed with wealth and devoid of compassion. This caricature became a central pillar of economic anti-Semitism, a specific brand of prejudice that uses economic stereotypes to justify hatred and discrimination. So, when we ask the question, why are Jews so rich? We are not just asking a simple question. We are stepping into a powerful river whose currents are thousands of years old, a river muddied by centuries of prejudice, envy, and violence. The question itself is built upon a mythical foundation. But buried beneath that myth, there is a complex truth. There exists a real and observable pattern of socioeconomic achievement that demands a real explanation. An explanation that has absolutely nothing to do with conspiracies or genetics, and everything to do with a unique and fascinating history of adaptation and resilience. To find that explanation, we must begin not in the banking houses of medieval Europe, but in the smoldering ashes of ancient Jerusalem nearly 2,000 years ago. Chapter 2. The Deep Roots of a Different Path. A history. To truly understand the unique economic trajectory of the Jewish people, you have to grasp the significance of a single, cataclysmic moment that changed everything. The year 70 CE. This was the year the unstoppable Roman army, after a brutal siege, breached the walls of Jerusalem and utterly destroyed the Second Temple. This was not just a building being torn down. It was the complete and violent obliteration of the undisputed center of Jewish religious, political, economic, and social life. The entire system of animal sacrifice, officiated by a hereditary priesthood, was over in an instant. The form of Judaism that had been practiced for 1,000 years was on the verge of extinction. For almost any other ancient people, this national trauma would have been the end of their story, but what happened next was nothing short of a revolution. A radical and brilliant reinvention that would, entirely by accident, set the Jewish people on a unique economic path for the next 2 millennia. Part 1. The Literacy Revolution. In the chaos and despair following the temple's destruction, a group of far-sighted scholars, led by a rabbi named Yohanan ben Zakkai, managed to escape Jerusalem and establish a new center of learning in the coastal town of Yavne. They were confronted with a monumental question. How could Judaism possibly survive without its central, unifying institution? Their answer was to enact one of the most successful intellectual pivots in human history. They decided to transform Judaism from a religion centered on a physical place, the temple, and a ritual act, sacrifice, to one centered on a sacred text, the Torah, and a required action, study. In this new paradigm, the local synagogue would replace the Grand Temple. The scholarly rabbi would replace the hereditary priest, and prayer and lifelong study would replace animal sacrifice. But this new, decentralized model came with a radical and unprecedented prerequisite. Every Jewish man was now expected to connect with God directly through the study of sacred texts. Then every Jewish man had to be able to read. And so the leaders of this nascent rabbinic Judaism made a decision that was almost unheard of in the ancient world. They effectively mandated universal male literacy. As the Talmud, the great compendium of Jewish law and thought, would later codify, a father was legally obligated to teach his son Torah. Communities were required to establish primary schools for young boys and to pay for their teachers. By the age of 6 or 7, at a time when the vast majority of children in the world were engaged in manual labor, Jewish boys were expected to begin their formal education in Hebrew and Aramaic. Let's pause for a moment to consider just how profoundly revolutionary this was. In the Roman Empire at the time, and for 1,000 years thereafter across Europe, literacy was the exclusive privilege of a tiny elite: scribes, aristocrats, and high-ranking clergy. For the average farmer or laborer, the written word was as alien as a foreign language. But within Jewish communities, a culture of literacy and intellectualism became deeply and fundamentally ingrained. The most respected and admired figure in the community was not the strongest warrior or the wealthiest landowner, but the most learned scholar. This represented a massive shift in societal values, one that prized intellectual and human capital above all other forms. This was not a calculated strategy for getting rich. It was a desperate and brilliant strategy for cultural and religious survival. The rabbis of that era had no idea. But in saving Judaism, they were also equipping their people with a powerful and uniquely portable set of cognitive skills: reading, writing, textual analysis, and the basic math required for commerce. Part 2. The urban shift. For the first several centuries after the temple's fall, this distinct advantage in skills didn't create a massive economic divergence. Most Jews, like most people throughout the Roman and post-Roman world, were still farmers and agricultural laborers. But this began to change dramatically around the 8th and 9th centuries, with the explosive rise of the Islamic Empire. The Abbasid Caliphate, ruling from its magnificent new capital in Baghdad, ushered in a golden age of economic growth, scientific discovery, urbanization, and international trade. Great cities like Baghdad, Cairo, and Cordoba in Spain became vibrant, cosmopolitan hubs of commerce and innovation, connecting continents. For the Jewish communities living within this new Islamic world, this burgeoning urban economy was a perfect match for their unique skill set. Their widespread literacy and numeracy gave them a significant competitive advantage in professions that were becoming central to city life. While an illiterate farmer would find it nearly impossible to adapt to the complexities of urban commerce, a literate Jewish individual could relatively easily become a merchant, a skilled craftsman, a doctor, a financier, or a bookkeeper. They could draft and interpret contracts, maintain detailed ledgers, and, crucially, communicate with business partners across vast geographical distances through writing. The economists Maristella Botticini and Zvi Eckstein, in their seminal work, argue compellingly that Jews were not, as previously thought, forced out of agriculture. Instead, they voluntarily chose to leave it because their skills allowed them to earn a much better living and achieve a higher quality of life in the cities. This is the period where we see the formation of the first truly global Jewish trade networks. A merchant based in Cordoba, Spain, could send a letter of credit, a sophisticated financial instrument, to a trusted partner in Cairo, who could then arrange for a shipment of spices and silks from India to be paid for upon arrival. These extensive networks were built on a foundation of a shared liturgical language, Hebrew, a common legal framework derived from the Talmud, and most importantly, a high degree of trust rooted in shared community and reputation. This period set a pattern that would come to define Jewish economic life for centuries to come, a concentration in skilled urban professions that relied on brains over brawn and on networks over land. Part 3. The Europeans, Exception, and the Burden of Money Lending. The situation that developed in Christian Europe, however, was starkly different and far more restrictive. As feudal society took shape during the Middle Ages, the entire economy was fundamentally based on land. Power, wealth, and status all flowed from the ownership of land. But in most of Europe, throughout the High Middle Ages, Jews were forbidden by law from owning land. They were also systematically blocked from joining the powerful craft guilds, the associations of bakers, carpenters, stonemasons, and weavers that controlled nearly all skilled jobs and trades within the cities. They were methodically and legally shut out of the two main pillars of the medieval economy. This is where the infamous and fateful turn to money lending becomes central to the story. As we mentioned earlier, Catholic doctrine forbade Christians from charging interest on loans, creating an enormous, unfulfilled demand for credit in a growing economy. With most other avenues blocked, Jewish communities were pushed into this economic gap. It was one of the very few viable and potentially profitable professions left open to them. This specialization is a classic example of what sociologists refer to as a middleman minority, a group that is ethnically distinct from the majority population, and is concentrated in intermediary roles in trade and finance, bridging the gap between the ruling elite and the masses. They are often economically successful, but also socially marginalized and vulnerable to persecution. Now, historians actively debate the precise nature of this shift. Was it a forced choice or a voluntary one? Some scholars argue that the severe legal restrictions left Jews with practically no other option for survival. But other scholars, like Botticini and Eckstein, argue that even before the most severe restrictions were in place, Jews were already voluntarily moving into finance because their high rates of literacy, numeracy, and access to international networks gave them a natural comparative advantage. Managing credit, assessing risk, and enforcing contracts over long distances are all skill-intensive activities, skills that Jewish communities had been honing for centuries. The truth is likely a complex mixture of both dynamics. A landscape of legal restrictions closed off most paths, while their unique cultural and intellectual toolkit made the remaining path of finance an especially logical and profitable one to take. This specialization had enormous and lasting consequences. It reinforced their status as perpetual outsiders, simultaneously necessary and hated. It further concentrated them in cities, making them an even more distinctly urban population. And, most critically, it forced them to value portable wealth above all else. When you live with the constant threat of being expelled from a country at a moment's notice, as Jews were from England in 1290, France in 1306, and Spain in 1492, owning land or fixed assets is a terrible investment. Your wealth had to be something you could carry with you: gold, precious gems, and most importantly of all, the knowledge in your head and the skills in your hands. This created a powerful, multi-generational incentive to invest not in land, but in human capital. Part 4. The New World and the Ladder of Success. When large waves of Jewish immigrants began arriving in the United States, first a smaller wave from Germany in the mid-19th century, and then a massive wave of over 2 million from Eastern Europe between 1880 and 1924, they brought this long and heavy historical baggage with them. They were, by and large, not farmers looking for land. They arrived with a cultural toolkit that was ready-made for success in an industrializing urban America. The classic story of the Eastern European Jewish immigrant in America begins on the crowded, teeming streets of the Lower East Side of New York. They started at the very bottom of the economic ladder, working grueling hours in garment industry sweatshops, or eking out a living as peddlers, pushing carts through the streets. But they displayed a remarkable tendency not to stay at the bottom. The peddler with the pushcart saved every penny to open a small candy store or tailor shop. His children, taking full advantage of the miracle of American public education, did not become peddlers or shopkeepers. They went to the free city colleges. They became doctors, lawyers, accountants, pharmacists, and teachers. This pattern of rapid upward mobility was stunning. Sociologists have consistently noted that Jewish immigrants, as a group, climbed the socioeconomic ladder faster than almost any other immigrant group in American history. This rapid ascent wasn't because they were inherently smarter or worked harder than, for example, the Irish or Italian immigrants who were arriving at the very same time and often living in the very same neighborhoods. It was because they arrived with a different set of cultural experiences and a different portfolio of skills, honed over centuries. They had generations of accumulated experience in urban commerce and skilled trades. They possessed a deep-seated cultural reverence for education, which they immediately and enthusiastically applied to the American secular education system. And they built strong, supportive community networks that provided social safety nets and crucial startup capital for new businesses. This unique history is the essential foundation upon which modern Jewish economic patterns are built. It is a history not of privilege, but of making a virtue out of necessity, of adapting to adversity, and of turning constraints into advantages. Chapter 3. The Unseen Inheritance. 4 core cultural values. History dealt the Jewish people a strange and often cruel hand of cards, forcing them down a distinct path of urban enterprise and intellectual pursuits. But history and external circumstances alone do not tell the complete story. The remarkable survival and eventual success of this scattered people also depended on a powerful set of cultural values that were meticulously transmitted from parent to child through generations. These values acted like a kind of cultural software, running on the hardware of their historical circumstances. They are the unseen inheritance that helps to explain the patterns of achievement we can observe today. Let's break them down into 4 core, interconnected ideas. Value. 1. The reverence for education and the mind. We have already touched upon how the religious necessity of literacy gave Jewish communities a significant head start in a mostly illiterate world. But the Jewish relationship with education goes much deeper than simply the functional ability to read. In traditional Jewish culture, learning is not just a means to an end, like getting a good job. It is considered a holy act in and of itself, a form of worship, and the highest pursuit of a lifetime. The greatest compliment you could pay someone in a traditional Jewish setting was not that they were rich or powerful, but that they were a Talmid Chacham, a wise and learned scholar. This ideal is embodied in the traditional practice of studying the Talmud, the vast and complex collection of Jewish law, philosophy, and folklore. Talmudic study is not a passive process of memorizing rules and facts. It is an intensely active, rigorous, and often loud process of logical reasoning, intellectual combat, and critical thinking. Students are traditionally paired up in a system called chevruta, or partnership, and are taught to question everything. They learn to analyze a text from every possible angle, to propose and defend arguments, to challenge the assumptions of their partners, their teachers, and even the sacred text itself. This centuries-old tradition cultivates a powerful and distinct kind of intellectual discipline. It trains the mind to be relentlessly analytical, to solve complex problems with abstract reasoning, and to appreciate nuance and multiple perspectives. So when millions of Jewish immigrants arrived in countries like the United States, which offered free and open access to secular higher education, they embraced the opportunity with incredible fervor. The old, deeply ingrained reverence for religious study was seamlessly and powerfully transferred to secular study. The doctor, the lawyer, the scientist, and the professor. These became the new, respected figures in the community, the modern-day inheritors of the scholar's mantle. The data bears this out dramatically. The 2020 Pew study found that an astounding 58% of Jewish Americans have at least a bachelor's degree, which is double the 29% figure for the general U.S. adult population. The gap is even wider for postgraduate degrees. 28% of Jewish adults hold one, compared to only 11% of all U.S. adults. This intense, culturally driven focus on education is, perhaps, the single most powerful driver of socioeconomic success in modern knowledge-based economies, as it serves as the primary gateway to high-paying, high-status professional careers. Value 2. A culture of resilience and long-term thinking. A history that is fundamentally defined by repeated persecution, devastating expulsions, and the constant threat of violence teaches you to plan for the long run. When your land and property can be confiscated in an instant by a hostile king or an angry mob, you learn to be prudent, to save for a rainy day, and to delay immediate gratification in favor of long-term security. This has fostered a cultural predisposition towards saving, towards careful risk management, and towards investing in things that cannot be easily taken away: your education, your skills, your reputation, and your relationships. The entire Jewish historical experience can be read as one long, painful lesson in risk management. Don't put all your eggs in one basket. Diversify your assets. Be prepared for the worst-case scenario. Because in Jewish history, the worst-case scenario has happened again and again. This long-term, risk-averse mindset can be seen in the historical preference for professions that offer a degree of autonomy, portability, and independence. Being a doctor, a lawyer, a diamond merchant, or an accountant means your primary asset is the intellectual capital stored in your brain. These skills are in demand in almost any society and are not tied to a specific piece of land or the whims of a particular political ruler. This long-term perspective also encourages a certain entrepreneurial spirit and a drive for self-reliance. If you learn over centuries that you cannot always rely on the stability and fairness of the wider society, you learn to rely on yourself and your own community. Value 3. The power of community. Kahila. It is impossible to talk about Jewish history or culture without understanding the central, non-negotiable role of the community, or Kahila in Hebrew. For a people who have spent the majority of their history living as a minority, often in hostile environments, community solidarity was never a lifestyle choice. It was an essential survival strategy. This necessity led to the development of a dense and sophisticated network of communal institutions that provide support to members from cradle to grave. At the very heart of this communal ethos is the concept of tzedakah. This Hebrew word is often translated as charity, but a more accurate and profound translation is justice or righteousness. In Jewish thought, giving assistance to those in need is not a magnanimous gesture of personal kindness. It is a moral and religious obligation. It is about ensuring a baseline of fairness and dignity within the community. This core principle led to the creation of an incredible internal welfare system. A key and powerful example is the Gemach, or Gemilut Chasadim, which is a free loan fund. For centuries, Jewish communities have operated these funds, providing interest-free loans to community members to start a business, pay for tuition, cover an unexpected medical expense, or simply get through a difficult period. Think for a moment about the incredible economic power of such an institution. It functions as a form of community-based, non-profit venture capital and social insurance rolled into one. It allows individuals to take calculated entrepreneurial risks they otherwise could never afford, knowing that the community provides a crucial safety net. It creates what some economists have called a circular economy, where wealth is created, and a significant portion is then philanthropically reinvested back into the community's institutions to help the next generation get ahead. This is not, as anti-Semitic propaganda claims, a conspiracy to help their own kind at the expense of others. It is a time-tested, internally focused strategy for a minority group to ensure its collective survival and advancement in a world that was often indifferent or hostile to its fate. Value 4. Embracing the outsider's perspective. Finally, there is a strange and counterintuitive advantage that can sometimes come from being a perpetual outsider. For the vast majority of their history, Jews were not part of the societal mainstream. They were observers, often living on the sidelines of power. This consistent outsider perspective can spark a unique kind of creativity, innovation, and a willingness to challenge the established order. When you are not deeply invested in the conventional wisdom or the status quo of the majority, You are sometimes freer to see new opportunities that others miss, or to question assumptions that others take for granted. You learn to be nimble, adaptable, and resourceful. This pattern can be seen in the disproportionate number of Jewish individuals who have been pioneers and innovators in new and disruptive fields. From the birth of the Hollywood studio system, where Jewish immigrants who were locked out of established industries like banking and manufacturing essentially built a new one from scratch, to the foundational pioneers of psychoanalysis like Freud, modern physics like Einstein, and more recently, the tech industry. There is a recurring pattern of challenging the status quo. This is the unexpected upside of a long and difficult history. Being an outsider forces you to be resourceful, creative, and willing to carve your own path when the main roads are blocked. Chapter 4. The data behind the story. We've journeyed through the deep history and explored the powerful cultural values that have shaped the unique Jewish economic story. But what does this look like in the world today? How do these long-term historical forces actually manifest in modern statistics? Let's turn to the data, which paints a clear picture that simultaneously confirms the trend of socioeconomic success while shattering the myth of universal wealth. The most comprehensive and authoritative recent data for the U.S. comes from that 2020 Pew Research Center survey. The findings on income are particularly striking. As we noted, U.S. Jews are, on average, a high-income demographic. The survey found that about 49% of Jewish adults describe their financial situation as comfortable. Let's compare that to the general U.S. public, where only 29% say the same. At the very top of the income ladder, the gap is even more pronounced. An impressive 23% of Jewish households report an annual income of $200,000 or more. That figure is nearly 6 times higher than the 4% reported for all U.S. households. On the other end of the spectrum, the data shows that only 10% of Jewish households have incomes under $30,000, compared to a much larger 26% of the general population. So, statistically speaking, the casual observation that the Jewish community has a higher than average income is, in fact, correct. But the crucial question is, where does this income advantage come from? The answer lies directly in the cultural and historical factors we've spent this time discussing, with education being the primary engine. The Pew data shows an ironclad link between educational attainment and income. And as we've seen, Jews have exceptionally high levels of education, with 58% holding a college degree and 28% holding a graduate degree. The community is heavily concentrated in high-skill, high-income professions. This preference for professional over agricultural or manual labor careers is not new. It has been passed down for generations. Fascinating economic history studies looking at Russian census data from the 19th century show that professional biases established in the Jewish community could last for over 200 years. Today, this long history translates into a significant presence in what are often called the professions: academia, medicine, law, and finance. Now, we must address the elephant in the room, the billionaire question. It is a statistical fact that a disproportionate number of the world's wealthiest people, particularly in the United States, are of Jewish descent. While Jewish people constitute less than 0.2% of the world's population, they often make up a significant percentage, sometimes cited as high as 10 to 20%, of lists like the Forbes 400, or of Nobel Prize laureates. Anti-Semites and conspiracy theorists seize upon this fact as irrefutable proof of a global financial conspiracy. The reality, however, is far more boring, logical, and consistent with everything else we have discussed. The very same factors that contribute to above-average success for the group as a whole, a powerful emphasis on education, strong community networks that provide venture capital, and a culture of entrepreneurship and risk management, are the exact same factors that, when combined with individual talent, ambition, and a healthy dose of luck can lead to massive outlier-level individual success. The historical concentration in finance, for instance, meant that for generations, some families and networks were building expertise and capital in that specific field. When modern global finance exploded in the 20th and 21st centuries, those with a multi-generational head start were uniquely positioned to benefit. These billionaires are the extreme end of the very same bell curve. They are not evidence of a conspiracy. They are evidence of the powerful compounding effects of cultural capital accumulated and reinvested over many, many generations. However, it is absolutely critical to balance this picture of success with the data that reveals the community's true diversity. The stereotype of wealth erases this complexity. For example, income levels vary significantly by religious denomination. Within the US, conservative and Reform Jews are, on average, much more likely to have high incomes than Orthodox Jews, who often prioritize religious study over secular careers and have larger families. And once we look globally, the picture of uniform wealth completely falls apart. Many Jewish communities in Israel, especially certain ultra-Orthodox and immigrant groups, face significant economic challenges. The same is true for the remnants of Jewish communities in the former Soviet Union. The narrative of a universally rich people simply does not hold up to scrutiny. The data tells a story not of a uniformly rich people, but of a group whose unique and often tragic history gave them a set of cultural tools that, on average, lead to better socioeconomic outcomes, particularly in modern, knowledge-based economies. Exploring these deep historical and cultural threads shows us that simple questions rarely, if ever, have simple answers. The story of Jewish economic life is a powerful and complex testament to resilience, adaptation, and the enduring power of culture. If you found this exploration valuable and want to see more deep dives into the complex intersections of history, culture, and society, please consider subscribing to the channel and hitting the notification bell. Your support is what allows us to continue tackling these important, sensitive, and often misunderstood topics. Also, let us know in the comments what other complex historical questions you'd like to see us explore in the future. So, we come all the way back to our initial heavily loaded question: why are Jews so rich? After this long journey through 2,000 years of history, culture, and data, we can see clearly that the question itself is the problem. It is built on a harmful and inaccurate stereotype that completely erases the economic struggles, the poverty, and the profound diversity that exists within the global Jewish community. The vast majority of Jewish people are not rich in the way the stereotype implies. They are middle-class professionals, small business owners, teachers, artists, and workers, just like the people in any other community. A much better, more accurate, and more productive question is, what historical and cultural factors have contributed to the Jewish community's observable, above-average socioeconomic success in many Western countries? And the answer to that question is complex, nuanced, fascinating, and has absolutely nothing to do with greed, conspiracy, or any kind of inherent racial or genetic trait. It's a story that starts with a religious and cultural revolution that mandated literacy nearly 2 millennia ago, inadvertently creating a people uniquely skilled for an urbanizing commercial world. It's a story of relentless persecution in Europe that, while devastating, forced a focus on portable intellectual capital and created a culture of long-term planning and risk management. It's a story of a deep and abiding cultural reverence for education, which in the modern world translates directly into professional success. And finally, it's a story of powerful, unbreakable community bonds of a people who learned over centuries that their very survival depended on supporting one another. The economic patterns we see today are the living echo of this long and often painful history. They are the cumulative result of a people adapting to centuries of being outsiders, turning disadvantage into an unlikely advantage, and investing in the one thing that could never be stolen, confiscated, or burned: the knowledge in their minds and the strength of their community. Perhaps the ultimate answer, then, is to redefine what it truly means to be rich. If richness is measured not just in dollars and cents, but in a wealth of knowledge passed down through generations, in a richness of community that supports its members in times of need, and in a wealth of resilience that has allowed a people to overcome unimaginable adversity and not only survive, but flourish, then this ceases to be just a story about the Jewish people. It becomes a universal story about the enduring power of human culture to shape our destiny.